Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football for us Michigan fans. There are endless storylines to talk about as Michigan rolls through spring practice. Now, for a lot of us, the bulk of our conversation early has been around the Michigan offense, has been around quarterback Bryce Underwood. I feel like people are sleeping on how good this Michigan defense can be in 2025, and I don't think it's necessarily us Michigan fans who are the ones sleeping. The Michigan fans who are listening to this, live and breathe this program. Y'all know what the roster looks like. You know the young talent that we have coming up on the defensive side of the football. Now, the national media, they'll take a look at the defense, look at Mason Graham going to the NFL, Kenneth Graham, Will Johnson going to the NFL. They'll probably make a broad assumption that when you lose, three guys that might be going in the first round of the NFL draft, no way you can be better than you were in 2024. I think a lot of us Michigan fans have kind of been saying that for the last couple of months. You're seeing some really intriguing storylines emerge on the defensive side of the football for Michigan. And we kind of said this heading into spring practice. Last year with Wink Martindale coming in, there was a lot of new. You're kind of drinking out of a fire hose, just trying to install the defense. I feel like going into year two with Wink Martindale, it's about building. It's about maximizing this defense. It's about figuring out the best positions for all of these players. Now we know the system. Now we got to go maximize it. And you're starting to see some of those storylines play out. I think most notably Mason Curtis, a guy that I'll put my hand up and say probably was sleeping on him as we previewed spring practice. This was a guy that played over 100 snaps in the month of November as a true freshman for Michigan in some big time moments. Not only do I think this staff thinks he's a really good football player, but they trusted him as a true freshman, and that matters. Now he's working a little bit more at nickel in the spring. Want to talk about what that means not only for Mason Curtis as a football player, who I just think is a unicorn individual, but also what does that mean for the secondary as a whole for Michigan heading into 2025? Want to highlight some other, younger players that are generating some buzz on the spring practice field. Before we get into it, as always, the Michigan fans just want to say thank you to you guys. It truly has been a blast talking this program as a Michigan fan myself. We've said it pretty much every episode. This spring practice window has been one of the more exciting ones to follow. The amount of Michigan fans who've been showing out to the boys and showing support means the world. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. Now, I think where you probably want to start is talking about Mason Curtis, the football player, who is a fascinating kid coming out of high school in the 2024 class. There were times where you thought he was going to be an edge rusher. There were times where you thought he was going to be an off-ball linebacker, and he kind of settled into that safety spot as a freshman. Now, he's a unique kid. He's 6'5", he's 200 pounds. This feels very similar to kind of what Michigan was looking for when Makari Page kicked down and played a little bit more nickel towards the end of the year. Having a guy like Mason Curtis potentially playing a little bit more nickel is huge. I think for the biggest reason, and that is the Big Ten's a unique conference. One weekend you might be going on the road and playing Iowa in Kinnick Stadium. That's running a ton of 12 personnel, maybe some I formation, really trying to load the box and play bully ball. And then the next week, you might be going on the road to Eugene, Oregon, where they're going to try to spread you out and play in space. What's intriguing about Mason Curtis specifically playing that nickel position is that when you play a team like Iowa, who you know is going to want to run the football, Mason Curtis has the size, the physicality of almost an off-ball linebacker. So when you want to put your nickel defense on the field, you feel pretty comfortable that when you're playing teams like Iowa or a team like Nebraska or a team like Minnesota that wants to run the football, you feel good about what Mason Curtis can do fitting the run. At times we thought he was going to be a linebacker for Michigan, but he also has some really special athleticism and length that allows him to operate in coverage. And that's the most important part of playing nickel. I mean, you go back to Mikey Sandstrom, what he meant to Michigan playing that nickel corner spot. He was a lead in coverage, really sticky in man coverage, but also was a guy that even though he wasn't as big as Mason Curtis, was really, really good filling the run game and tackling in the box. And if you're going to play nickel, which is essentially, hey, we're going to put one more defensive back on the football field and take off a linebacker, you got to be able to support the run. I think Mason Curtis can not only provide a ton of value supporting the run, but he's a guy working against, those jumbo slots. A guy like Tyler Warren from Penn State last year, he's 6'5", 200. He can use that length, use that physicality to deal with some of those jumbo pass catchers that you see in the slot. And maybe sometimes he's playing safety. Maybe sometimes he's playing nickel. When you're playing a team like Iowa or Minnesota that wants to run the football, maybe he's the ideal guy to play at nickel. And then when you're playing a team like Oregon, maybe he kicks back to safety. Really, really intriguing storyline. And another intriguing storyline that relates to the secondary is Shamari Earls is that guy. I mean, Shamari Earls sounds to be a guy that Michigan has a lot of confidence that can play early. Now, we knew when Shamari Earls committed to Michigan, we knew when he was coming into the Michigan in the winter, we knew he was physically ready. He was 6'2", 200 plus pounds, state champ long jumper, 10.8 in the 100-meter dash. He checks off every single athletic profile you want in terms of playing boundary cornerback at the Big Ten level. I think the conversation was, hey, between the years, are you going to be ready? Well, it sounds like he is. Now, why is that such a big storyline for Michigan, regardless if he starts for Michigan or not? Having some more depth in the boundary cornerback room is huge, because you look at Michigan, how this secondary might shake out. Maybe you want to play Zeke Berry at nickel too. And so if you probably can't play Zeke Berry at nickel unless Shamari Earls can play. Because if Shamari Earls is not ready as a freshman, Jair Hill, Josiah Edmond, Zeke Berry are the only boundary cornerbacks that you like or that you trust maybe. Well, if Shamari Earls becomes that fourth boundary cornerback, now we feel pretty good about the depth at boundary cornerback, which allows us to kind of move Zeke Berry around and play him in the ideal position. I think the biggest storyline that we're seeing play out is kind of how we started this thing. And that is, last year we just had to get the system right. And you saw the growing pains early in 2024. That defense at times, especially on the road at Washington last year, felt like it wasn't maximized. Felt like it left a little bit to be desired. Well, in the back half of 2024 against Northwestern, Ohio State, Alabama, this Michigan defense really turned it on. And so I feel like going into this offseason, this spring practice session, it's less about let's just learn this system and now let's maximize it and let's move some players around and let's find the ideal ways to use a player like Mason Curtis or use a player like Zeke Berry or use a player like Jayshon Barham. It's about elevating. And I'm really excited about what this defense can be in the 2025 year. Now, here's another question that I would love to hear from the Michigan fans. Who's going to be the next TJ guy? And what I mean by that is TJ guy last year, going into the 2024 season, had never really played a ton of significant snaps for Michigan. Kind of came out of nowhere, became a very valuable piece, especially in the pass rush for Michigan. So now you have Derek Moore and TJ guy. You feel really good about your two starting edge defenders. Who's going to be the guy that takes that step and becomes the new TJ guy in 2025? The guy I'm personally kind of betting on is Dominic Nichols. He's a long, really twitchy, fluid athlete coming out of high school that probably needed to add some weight to his frame. He said in his press conference this morning, he's up around 10, 15 pounds, playing closer to 255 pounds, 250. That's big. He's a guy that you probably needed to fill out a little bit more. Cam Brandt's another guy that I thought played very good football for Michigan. No, I think Dominic Nichols has a little bit of a higher ceiling, especially what he can do rushing the passer. But you got some young edge defenders that, hey, we know we got two in TJ Guy and Derek Moore. Two of the best in the Big Ten. Derek Moore might be the best in the Big Ten. Dom Nichols, Cam Brandt filling in the depth, potentially true freshman Nate Marshall coming in the summer. We got some guys that can kind of step up the way TJ Guy did last year, who are going to get more opportunity. And now the question is, who is going to take it and run with that opportunity? I think another storyline here in the last one, and we'll close it out, is offensive line depth emerging. And I think there's two names that are generating the most amount of buzz. One, Brady Norton, who I think a lot of Michigan fans were kind of just confused about how to feel about Brady Norton. I personally liked him coming from Cal Poly. He was a redshirt freshman last year, played every single game for them at tackle, really graded out well, and I thought looked like a really good athlete at the tackle position. Then he comes in at 275. And then you have question marks about it. Is Brady Norton going to be big enough to jump up from the FCS to the Big Ten level? Grant Newsom was pretty vocal that Brady Norton is not really having those growing pains that some of us expected. You're hearing some of the other players like Dom Nichols say, hey, Brady Norton, dude's an athlete. He is hard to work against, especially at the tackle position. I think what's so unique about Brady Norton, he could play guard, play tackle. I like him more at tackle, and I know he doesn't have the prototypical 6'5" frame of an offensive tackle, but he's a really, really good athlete. We want all the tackle depth we can get. Evan Link, Andrew Sprague, I think you're excited about what those two can be. Again, young offensive linemen who are still developing and potentially could blossom into some really good football players. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of us Michigan fans wouldn't mind hearing that Brady Norton's pushing, Andrew Babalow is pushing, because you want as much competitive depth in that room to ensure that it's going to be solid in the 2025 year. Another player that's emerging, and I really wouldn't be surprised if he can push for a starting spot, is Jake Winera. And then a three-star prospect from the state of Florida that I know Michigan loved, even though the recruiting services didn't. He's listed as a three-star guy. Michigan liked him a lot. He comes in early enrollee last year. I thought looked awesome in the spring game. And you kind of knew he wasn't going to start as a true freshman, but it also caught your attention that this guy that should be, a senior in high school last year, I thought held up in a Michigan spring game that you're going up against some big dogs on the defensive line. You're hearing all the right things from Jake Winera. He's up to 320 pounds. What's he look like going into year two? And can he maybe contend for either the starting center spot or guard spot? Because I think a lot of Michigan fans probably agree with, look, we're confident with Greg Crippen coming back for one more year, but I think Greg Crippen played himself into a spot where it's like no competition. That's what you want your offensive line to look like. A returning starter who we think can be pretty solid in Greg Crippen, with a young, hungry dog and Jake Winera pushing. The depth on the offensive line, maybe us feeling better about what it looks like going into 2025, is big for us Michigan. I mean, we're trying to get back. We had a lot of work to do in terms of just replacing a ton of football players after that national championship year. I feel like going into 2025, not only a little bit more continuity with guys that have played more together, but you also probably feel better about where the overall depth of the room looks like as well. We went 12 minutes, didn't even talk once about Bryce Underwood. And I'll say this, so there ain't much more. We've talked a lot about Bryce. You continue to hear that he looks different. He's a difference maker at the quarterback position. You're hearing all the right things. We'll talk more about Bryce when we have more to talk about with Bryce Underwood. Appreciate you guys rocking with it again. I would love to hear how the Michigan fans are feeling about Mason Curtis. I thought that was kind of an intriguing little nugget we're getting out of spring practice. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.